So, good morning. Welcome again to this project cycle course. We are going to start the second session. It is important to continue with our analysis of problems and objectives. We are in a small group, so we have more advantage to sharing, solving our doubts, and learning together. This is the idea, to learn together. Thank you, Nicolo, for your guidance, and we hope that today's session will be fruitful for everyone. So, welcome, everybody.
Thank you very much. So we'll share our presentation. Okay, so thank you, Diego. As we saw last time we had a brief overview of the different sections of our course. Maybe I can just say a couple of words, as Oksana wasn't present last time. We introduced the idea of project cycle, which means that a project is always a set of activities with determined objectives and a determined time frame and budget, which is not an isolated activity, but it is within a project cycle. So there is a broader framework, a programming broader framework within which each project is inserted. Within this framework, there is an identification phase which narrows down the ideas, the objectives of the project. Formulation phase, where we formulate the objectives, the activities of our project. Financing is searching for means to support our project. An implementation phase, where we realize the activities, and then an evaluation, which gives us a feedback of how the project has performed and how the context has changed. And this evaluation phase will feed the new programming phase. So it will give us the possibility to update our broader framework within which to identify new actions to be taken, new problems to be tackled. So this is one main thing, and the other was the project definition, actually. So what a project is, it is a series of activities that are aimed at specific objectives within a defined time period and with a defined budget. So the main things here are activities, objectives, time, and budget. We stressed quite a lot last time that it is important to understand the difference between activities and objectives. An objective is a situation that has changed from a problem to a positive situation. So it's what we desire from the project, what the outcome that we desire from the project, while the activities are the concrete actions that have to be taken to get to these objectives, to obtain these objectives. And of course, a project has a time frame, can be different time frames, 1 year, 3 years, 6 months, or whatever, and a defined budget. So all these elements are linked together, and they are linked to the analysis of the problems that have to be faced. So this is just a brief introduction to the analysis phase, which is what we will see a bit more in depth today. The analysis phase has different steps, different aspects, and then it will lead to the planning phase, which is what we will see next time. So the analysis phase is within the context of a project. So we saw that the project cycle has different steps, but once we get to the to identify a project, we start with the analysis. What we want to analyze is basically the stakeholders, so all the people, organizations who may have a role in the project. Then the problem analysis, identifying the main problems and ordering the problems in a logical structure. That is what was the objective of the exercise for today. We will see the example that Marta has and her organization has realized. This is, let's say, the problem and objective analysis are the key steps, because they allow us to identify the main structure of a project. The exercise, for who maybe didn't see the exercise or didn't have time to work on it, was to produce a problem and objective tree with a project of your choice. This means to identify and order the different problems that lead to a central problem that we recognize as a central problem that our project will have to face, and then identify the effects of this central problem and see how they are ordered logically. So the idea is that the logic is to order the problems in an order of causes to effects, so that we can obtain this project problem tree, and then build an objective tree, which means change the problem statements to objective statements, so to positive situations, desirable situations that our project will try to obtain. Anyway, we will see this with an example, but going back to the analysis phase, let's say the problem and objective analysis is what we saw more in detail with the objective and problem trees, and the strategy analysis identifies different lines of action that our project can choose to face the central problem that we have identified. I think we will be able to see this as well with the example that we will see later, because of course problems are usually very complex, and there are many causes for the main problem that we identified, but it is not always possible to work on all the causes because we have limited budget or limited experience or capacities to face the different components of a complex problem. This is why sometimes we choose to leave some lines of action outside of our project, but this is possible, but we have to be aware of the consequences that this can have, because the parts that we leave outside of the control of our project will somehow have to be faced, maybe by some other organization, maybe by public institutions. So this idea is that we should keep in mind that our project can face directly a strategy, so some problems, but that our strategy doesn't face the whole complex of the problems. Then we will see next in the next session the planning phase, which will consist in the development of a logical framework, which is a tool that allows us to define the project structure, to test its logic, its internal logic, to formulate indicators that allow us to measure the success of the project, and to also keep in mind which are the external elements. So what is not in our strategy, but that we have to monitor in order to be able to face any risk that may arise in case the external elements are not realized or may be cause a problem to our activities. Once we have the logical framework, the logical structure of the project, we can schedule the activities, which are the concrete actions that lead to the results of our project. And then we can schedule the resources, so see what is necessary to realize the activities. So let's see the first step, stakeholder analysis. So who are the stakeholders of a project? They are groups or individuals whose interests are positively or negatively impacted by the project, or whose interests can impact the project. So they can be impacted, or they can have an influence on the project. There are many different types of stakeholders which have different levels of interest in the project, and that can have a different level of influence on our project. So we will characterize the stakeholders, especially using this understanding exactly what their interest and what their influence in the project can be. Some examples of stakeholders can be, of course, the beneficiaries of the project, the partner organizations that contribute to the realization of a project, the donors, of course, who can be large or small organizations, individuals that somehow contribute to the project, the project staff, the volunteers, regulatory bodies. This is a special case that in many projects can have a strong influence in our project. So they have to be carefully identified and monitored. Local authorities, national, local government can have a role. The media can have a role in informing positively or negatively about our projects. And social, political, religious entities are other possible stakeholders. This is just a list of examples, but if you know the context of your project, you will maybe identify different stakeholders. The important thing is to understand that people or groups or organizations who can influence or can be influenced positively or negatively by the project are all stakeholders, and they all have to be somehow taken into account. As we said, the stakeholders have different levels of interest in a project, and their influence on the project can also vary. This is very important to identify the different levels of interest and influence to minimize risks and to maximize the contribution of each stakeholder to our activities. In this slide, we can have an idea of a possible way of analyzing the stakeholders, considering these two parameters of influence and interest in our project. So we have 4 sections, and we have 2 directions. So in the vertical direction, we measure influence from low to high, and in the horizontal direction, we measure interest in the project. So in the low left section, we have the stakeholders with a low influence and low interest in the project. For instance, we can consider supporting services or services that are let's say partners or stakeholders that give supporting services to our project. So they normally are important for the project, but they don't have a very high influence, and they are not particularly interested in the outcomes of our projects. In this case, let's say these stakeholders they sit on the periphery of our project. However, it is possible that from time to time, their level of influence may vary. Maybe there are critical moments in the project where their services are crucial to the project. So the idea is to monitor these stakeholders in order to keep them informed, to encourage them to be sure that when needed, their contribution is given effectively. So we characterize these 4, let's say, kinds of stakeholders with a word that indicates let's say, our attitude towards them. So in this case, it is important to monitor these low influence and low interest stakeholders. Going up on the scale of influence, we find a category of stakeholders who have a high influence in our project, however, are not particularly interested in the outcomes of the project, but they are highly influential. Regulators, for instance, can have a high influence, enabling our project to pursue its objectives, but also blocking our project if the case arises. So in this case, we have the idea is to satisfy this kind of stakeholder, so give all the information that is needed, keep them informed, ensure that they understand our project so that their influence may be positive on the the activities and on the results of our program. In the lower right part of our diagram, we find the stakeholders with low influence and high interest. Typically, the end users of a program, the beneficiaries, are low influence, high interest. So they are highly interested in the outcomes of the project. They are the ones who benefit from the services and of the project, but they don't really have a very high influence on the realization of activities and of the project. However, the idea is that they have to be well informed on how the project is working, so that they can really benefit from its services. And another important attitude towards this kind of stakeholder is to consult them also on their interest in the project, because they can give valuable information about the quality of the project and of the services that we are giving to the beneficiaries. The level of satisfaction, the level of usefulness of the services can be also monitored, gaining information and consulting this category of stakeholder in order to introduce changes if needed in our project, or better inform on the services that our project is realizing. And the last category is the one of the key stakeholders that have high influence and high interest. So they can deeply influence our project. For instance, the stakeholders who provide means for the project, who invest in our project, or senior officials in organizations that have a high and important role in our project. They usually are high influence and high interest, so they are interested in good results of our project, but they can also influence our project highly. So they have to be carefully managed in order to retain their support, keep them informed and involve them in the decisions, in order to engage them in their respective roles. So as you can see, of course, this is maybe an oversimplifying the analysis, but as for other aspects of this course, we are sometimes simplifying to help in understanding how the different mechanisms work. Of course, in real life, things are more complex, and of course, the types of stakeholders can be many and different. But the idea is to try as far as possible to characterize each stakeholder, so that we can have a good idea of the risks and potential of each stakeholder, and manage them accordingly to obtain the best results for our project. In order to perform this analysis, a possible simple method can be to build this kind of stakeholder analysis matrix, which is a simple sheet where we list the different stakeholders, and we try to specify for each stakeholder the levels of interest, of influence, with specific questions that we ask ourselves, and we try to identify for each stakeholder. So we have a very simple example here. Consider a project in the health sector, and we have an example of three kinds of different stakeholders: the nurses union, patients advocacy group, and a newspaper. So for each group we will have a contact person, and then we will have an appreciation of their interest and influence. So we will be able to see, to appreciate if the level of interest or influence is high, low, or medium. In this case, for instance, we can identify that the nurses union has a high interest and a high influence in the project, the advocacy group a high interest and a medium influence, and the newspaper, we characterize it by a low interest because it doesn't benefit directly from the project, but a high influence in the project. So why do they have these levels of interest and influence? And this is what we try to understand with the following three questions that we should try and answer. So concerning the interest, what we should ask ourselves, what is important to the stakeholder? So for instance, in the case of the nurses union, it is important for them, so seen by their point of view, to maintain working conditions for nurses in the context in which the project is operating. For the patient advocacy group, the importance of the group is maximizing quality of care for patients. So their interest is to maximize the quality of care. And for the paper, a possible interest may be of getting a good story to publish about the project. So having, as you can see, it is a low interest in this case, while in the first two cases, the interest is high because they benefit directly from the consequences and results of our project. The other two questions concern the influence. So the first is, and they concern the positive or negative influence that each group can have on the project. So the first is, how could the stakeholder contribute to the project? So which is the positive influence that the stakeholder may have on our project? In the case of the union, they may agree to implement possible new reforms that our project is going to introduce. So it is a positive influence. However, they could also have a negative influence. How could the stakeholder block the project? So they could go on strike, they could somehow oppose the new reforms that the project is wishing to realize. For the patient advocacy group, they could contribute positively, expressing their support to the reforms, maybe to other stakeholders, so that we can enlarge the impact of our project and have a good reception of the results and the new services of the project. But they could also block the project, making complaints about the quality of the service. So these are things that they may do and that we should understand in order to understand what is wrong with our project and how we can change activities so that we can overcome this problem. The newspaper could contribute supporting our project, giving information about our project, but also print stories that oppose our reforms. So in this case, we will have to be very monitor carefully what is going on with the different stakeholders in a positive or negative way. And to do this, it is useful to identify a strategy to engage each stakeholder. So how are we going to keep track of what each stakeholder is doing, what is their attitude? We will have to plan a concrete strategy. Now we have different possible ways: monthly roundtables, information feedback meetings. These are just some examples, but the idea is to have a clear plan on how to engage each stakeholder on the based on their interest, influence, and role in the project. So the idea is not to go to or engage the stakeholder just if we have an emergency, so if they are blocking the project or if they have a problem, but planning a strategy that will allow us to engage them in a continuous way and keep a good contact and a good level of interest in the different stakeholders. As we saw before, and then we might see better with the logical framework, when we talked about the strategy, we mentioned that some actions are not under the direct control of the project, but are under the control of other organizations that may be different stakeholders. So we have to make sure that what they have to do to contribute to the objective of our project is done. This is why it is very important to plan systematically an engagement strategy for the different stakeholders. Moving on to the problem and objective analysis. Okay, this is the objective of was the objective of the exercise for today, but we can see briefly what we are talking about when we do a problem and objective analysis, and what the problems may be in the realization of this task. So as you saw, the problem tree is a structured identification of problems ordered according to a cause-effect logic, identifying a central problem. So this is very important in the logic of a project, because a project is let's say it's a way of simplifying somehow a very complex problem and concentrating on a few tasks and a few objectives that we want to obtain. So identifying a central problem gives us the scope of our project. It gives us what we want to obtain. Of course, the reality is much more complex, but we have to identify a single central problem. This is why many agencies, funding organizations recommend to identify one specific objective, only one, which means identify one single central problem for a project. In some formulations, you can see different specific objectives. I think that this formulation doesn't help in the clarity of a project because it is important to identify the central problem and the central objective. Then to be able to represent the complexity of a project, we can define different results. So objectives of a lower level, which lead to our central or specific objective. But yes, it is very important to identify a central problem. If it is not possible to identify only one central problem, maybe that means that the problem is too complex for a single project to tackle. In this case, it might be useful to think of two projects, two components to tackle a single central problem. So once we identify the problems, this structure will lead us to an objective tree, which is obtained by transforming the problems into a set of future solutions, which are the objectives and the results. So each negative problem is converted into an objective, rewriting it as a positive future situation statement. The examples here are very simple, but they give an idea. A low agricultural production problem becomes high agricultural production objective, or an insufficient medical staff in rural areas becomes increased medical staff in rural areas, or sufficient medical staff in rural areas. So what we state in an objective is a situation. It's not the activities that we do to get to the situation, but the situation we desire. For instance, in high agricultural production, this, as you can see, doesn't indicate what we do to get to a high agricultural production. It may be different things. For instance, using good quality seeds, or improving agricultural management of a certain cultivation, working on the training of farmers, working on irrigation systems. We can really work on different types of actions, different strategies, as you can see, but they all lead to this central objective, this central positive situation. Of course, the problems and the objectives, as you have seen in the example of the problem objective tree, have different levels, and the different levels correspond to the different levels of the problems, have a correspondence in different levels of objectives. So normally in a project, we will see it in the logical framework, you have 3 levels. The goals or general objectives, which are the high-level objectives of our project, And they are the objectives that the project alone is not able to meet. So our project will contribute to the main goal, to the general goal. It will not meet the general goal alone, but it will contribute with other actions to the general goal. So these are the high-level problems and objectives. The main purpose, the main problem corresponds to the purpose or specific objective. There are different ways of calling this level of objectives. So this is what our project will obtain within its time frame and with the budget that has been decided. So we have to get to the purpose. This is why it is always very important to define clearly what our purpose is, because it has to be something that we will be able to understand if it has been met, to be able to measure. So this level is the purpose or specific objective level, and is the one that as I said, would be good practice to be just one, so that each project is very well characterized and is very clear. This is also very important when we submit a project for funding to an institution, to a foundation, or somebody who we asked support for our project. If our project has a good logic and a very specific and clear objective, it really helps for who reads the project, to whom has to evaluate the project, to understand it fully, to really understand the scope of the project, the possible impact of the project. If a project has many different objectives and is not clearly defined, then it is much harder for who evaluates the project to understand its effectiveness and its possible and potential impact. So I think this is an important element, one specific objective. And at a lower level, you see that the lower level problems are converted to lower level objectives, which in the logical framework we call results. Many times you will find in the different templates for logical frameworks or projects, different ways of calling these objectives. Sometimes you hear about goals, purpose, results, or general objective, specific objective, results, but also outputs and outcomes. For instance, outputs and outcomes are two different levels, low-level objectives. Basically, an output is a direct production of our activity. An outcome is the consequence of that. An example can be a training course. So if we realize a training course, the output of the course may be that we have a certain number of people who have completed a training course within a certain time frame and with a certain level of participation in the course. So it's the output, the direct product of our activity. However, the outcome of the course is the effects. So how did this course change the capacities of the participants, how the course has had an impact on the participants. So what new skills do they have? How do they apply their new skills? Are they able to apply their new skills? And in what measure are they able to do it? So as you can see, it is difficult to give just one definition of all these different levels of objectives, because you will find many in the different documents and templates. However, I think that if we understand what an objective is, and we define exactly what an activity is, and we understand that objectives are changed situations of different level, then we can interpret effectively and understand effectively the different ways that the different donors ask us to present the objectives of our activity. So I think that we should stress in this context the logic that is behind a definition of objectives and activities. So going back to the formulation of an objective tree, the steps that we should take are basically reformulating all the negative situations of the problem tree into positive or desirable situations that are realistically achievable. This is very important because normally, well, many times in the formulation of objectives, you can find objectives which are very hard to achieve because they are unrealistic. They are maybe excessively ambitious or are difficult to realize. So it is very important to formulate the objectives and verify that these objectives may be realistically achievable. The second step would be to check the means-ends relationship to ensure that the relationships, the cause-effect relationships in the problem tree are turned into means-ends relationships in the objective tree. So we have to verify that the low-level objectives that we set for our project may be useful to meet the higher level objectives, so that the means ends logic is effective. So sometimes we might, in formulating something, a problem and objective structure, we can find situations where a lower level objective seems to be obtained by a higher level objective. So we have to turn them around. So we have to verify the logic so that we have a correct structure. And this is important because once we identify the results, which are the lower level objectives, those results will allow us to identify the actions, the activities necessary to realize these results, and consequently the costs of the project. So it is important not to get it wrong at this level, because if the results are of a too high level, probably they won't be directly achievable by a set of activities. So we have to understand that the lower level results are results that can be achieved through a clear set of activities. Then we will see this in the logical framework, and it will be more clear. And the last step is to revise the statements, because if the structure is not complete or we see a problem in the logic of the structure, it may be necessary to add new objectives or to change the levels of the different objectives or delete objectives that may not be necessary or suitable in the project. So this process is a dynamic process. The idea is that when we work on the problem and objective tree, we do it in a dynamic way. So we state the problems, we state the objectives, and then we revise the objectives. If the structure of the objectives is not convincing, there is some problems in the logic of the objectives, it probably means that the structure of the problems may be not well structured. So we can go back to the problems and reformulate the problem structure. So the two ways of seeing the situation in a negative and positive way can interact with one another and help us define a better structure of the situation. So we don't have to be shy in trying to formulate before a problem tree and then an objective tree as we gather the ideas. It's a kind of brainstorming process. So we formulate them, then we verify the structure, and we can go back to the problems and then to the objectives again to fine-tune the structure. But the idea, of course, is that the problems and the objectives, as they are strictly linked, they need to be analyzed in connection one another. An example is sometimes when if we skip, because we all usually work under pressure when preparing a project, and sometimes we just skip the problem analysis and we try to set up an objective tree, an objective analysis, because this is what the donor asks for. And sometimes this objective analysis is not convincing. It doesn't really help us, and it doesn't convince us. So a good practice in this case is to try really to go back to the problems. So to see why this, which is the reason for the objective structure that we have set up. So the two things are a dynamic process and should be both considered without skipping the problem analysis. Reformulating problem statements into objective statements, as we said, is quite a straightforward process. We have some examples here, very simple, but that give you an idea. Problem statement, river water quality is deteriorating, can be formulated as the quality of river water is improved. So as you see, there is no indication of how we are going to do this yet, because this is an objective, so it's what we desire for our project. And then with the activities, we will have to identify the steps needed to improve the water quality, which can be different steps, working, for instance, on the agricultural activities within the catchment of the river, so as to avoid the spillover of fertilizer in the river, or it can be working on sanitation. I mean, there are different strategies, but the objective has to be what we want, the situation that we desire in the future. Another example is loss of confidence in public services, and can be transformed into people's confidence in public services is restored. Then, of course, our strategy and our activities will define how to do this. Or public transportation is in bad condition, public transportation is kept in good condition. This is a simple example of how an objective statement can be formulated in a wrong way. For instance, lack of adequate rain levels can be a problem statement. But of course, we cannot transform this problem in adequate rain levels available, because we have no control on rain levels. We can't intervene in the natural phenomenon. That means that the objective that we would obtain directly changing the problem statement is unrealistic. So we have to revise the statement and reformulate it in a realistic way. So, for instance, if we are working in an agricultural context where the lack of adequate rain levels is a crucial problem, because the farmers are not able to realize their crops, then we can rewrite the objective as irrigation system established and operational. So it is a way of obtaining a positive situation that gives an answer to the problem, but in a realistic way, in a possible way. So this is important when we formulate the objective, that they should be as realistic as possible. Okay, so this is basically what I wanted to talk about today. Then the rest of the session would be dedicated to analyze the exercises. We just have one today, but we can work on this. But before starting this part, do you have any questions and any comments on what we saw so far? Oksana?
Here I am. I was very glad to see the slide 8. Could you please return it? It was quite new for me. We have all these ideas in head while projecting, but not in such clear way. And I would make a small comment. We have kind of target group, which are parents of our kids, or members of families, peoples with disability. And they usually are in the square right low, because they have a high interest and low influence. And the last years our project is to make them more capable, and we work on to make them up in their square. We make a lot of activity to make their voice louder. We teach them how to communicate with press, with media, with journalists, how to make better their legal knowledge, their understanding of situation, the legal situation, the mechanism of how their decisions are making, and we ask them sometimes to write letters to authorities on the points which are essential for the project. And my thesis is that sometimes project can aim at changing the place of a stakeholder on this map, to move them a little higher on the scale of influence. And the second question is, where is, on your point of view, staff of the project, in which square?
Okay, thank you very much, Oksana, for your comments and questions. Well, I think the first is basically not a question, but a comment, which I agree. It can be, of course, there can be a case in which stakeholders can be changed by the project, and one of the objectives of the project can be to enhance certain characteristics or capabilities of a stakeholder group that can change their influence in the project. So yeah, I agree that that can be the case, and thank you for this observation, because I think it is important to underline that this analysis also is a dynamic analysis, because the project has a certain extension, and many changes take place during the project. So also the stakeholders change during the project, and they can change their characteristics. This is why it is important to monitor the different stakeholders and keep them informed, and especially getting feedback from the stakeholders so that we can have more information on let's say on the quality and on the impact of our project. Concerning the second questions, what about the staff of the project? Well, I think they have a high influence, because of course they are the people who realize the activities, can really change the way things are done. They have a marginal interest because usually it's their job, and this has to be considered as well, because in the case of paid staff, they have an interest that the project is successful, is going well, that might lead to good results. Many times in young staff, an interest in the project is the experience they gain in working in a project. So this can be something that can also be, let's say, a good thing, because staff who wants to gain a good experience is likely to work with effectiveness, trying to learn, and so trying to be effective in working on the project. Well, this is a different domain, but it is actually it forms part of the stakeholder analysis. When we select the staff of the project, many times we are, confronted with the problem if choosing staff with a very high experience, which possibly can give a very good input to the project, but maybe has a bit less interest in the project. If we want to analyze it with an interest, influence, methodology. So I would say that, for instance, a highly skilled staff would have a very high influence, but maybe a lower interest in the project, while a lower level, a lower skilled person would have a lower influence, maybe, but a higher interest. Mm-hmm. So these things should be, considered. They can be a way of considering a particular category of stakeholders that are the project staff, which are a very important stakeholder, of course.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Very interesting comments.
Thank you, Oksana. Okay, so if you don't have other comments, we can have a look at the problem and opportunity tree that Marta and Gaia, worked on. It's a little small. I can try to maybe. I hope it is. You can see it. So, as Marta said at the beginning of our session, they used a bit of a different template to build this problem and objective tree. They called it problems tree and opportunities tree. This is very interesting because, of course, what we are trying to do here is not to give an exact way of doing things. There are many different ways of doing things that are all different, effective, and they depend on the way the different organizations do and work, and it depends also on the different requirements of the organizations that may finance or support somehow our project. However, of course, the idea is not to give a specific way of doing things, but to give a knowledge that can help us understand the logic that is behind the different ways of doing things. So in this case, for instance, we have a problem tree that leads to a central problem, which is lack of socioeconomic integration for refugees. Well, I think this is a very clear statement. It gives us an idea of who we are talking about, refugees, what is the problem, socioeconomic integration. So it's integration with different dimensions, social and economic dimensions. So as you can see, a central problem is a high-level problem. So it is a complex problem. And to tackle this problem, we have to work on the complexity of this problem. So what you identified here are different lines of action, which also seem to me very well identified and clear. Exclusion from labor market, so the problem of the labor market, specifically of the labor market. Difficulties in optimizing the training offer for migrants. So we have a training line, social isolation, so specific social problem, and exclusion. Going down in the lines, of course, we have here specific lower level problems. So the exclusion from the labor market is broken down in different specific projects. So the difficulties in finding a job are basically due to language barriers, lack of soft skills, scarce knowledge of the labor market. As you can see, these problems are actually very clear and can be acted upon, because if we see the corresponding opportunities or objective structure, the language barriers correspond to improved Italian skills. That is very specific. So what we want is that the beneficiaries have improved Italian skills, and this can be easily done with Italian courses, training, or soft skills enhancement. Or actually, this definition, this formulation would be not fully correct, in the sense that it would be maybe more correct to say that the beneficiaries have enhanced soft skills. So it is more clear that it is a situation after the project. It's not an action, it's not the announcement of soft skills, but it would be that they have more soft skills. And of course, the activities needed to obtain this would be a series of activities like trainings, group activities to enhance the soft skills. But I mean, the structure is very clear.
But in this case, is to let them to know how many soft skills they are, because they don't have the knowledge about this.
Okay. So in this case, this is very useful. It should be stated more clearly. One of the assumptions that sometimes we do when we work on these problem and opportunity trees is that as we know very well what we're talking about, we assume that who reads it knows the context. And this can be a problem because I don't know the context, and so it is maybe harder for me to understand exactly what you mean. This is why when you formulate a problem or an objective, you should try to be as specific as possible, and avoid to assume that who reads knows exactly the context. Okay, so this helps us to clarify this aspect as well. The other lines of action, well, I think they are quite straightforward as well. So there are maybe two comments. One is this structure, as you can see, just has the lower part of the structure of the problem and objective tree that we presented, this one. So as you can see, this structure has a double level. So it has the central objective and central problem and central objective, and all the problems leading to the central problem and the objectives leading to the purpose. But on the higher level, it has the consequences of the effects of the central problem and the ends, the higher level objectives of the central purpose of the problem, of the project. This part of the analysis, the higher part of the analysis, doesn't directly concern, as we said, our project, in the sense that what we will realize with our project is the purpose. So we will arrive to this level, the level of the purpose. However, it is important to identify the consequences, because it gives us how our project will impact the broader context. So it is recommendable to perform this higher level of analysis as well, in order to be able to give an idea of how our project will impact the broader context. Because, for instance, there might be a funding organization that is interested in working in a certain context and wants to fund different projects with different approaches that all contribute to a certain higher level problem. So it is important for this kind of donor to understand not only what the project will do directly and specifically, but how the project sees its impact in the broader context. This is the idea of the goals, the general objectives, and so the analysis of this higher part of the problem and objective analysis. This is just to give an idea of why we do this analysis at different levels. So this is one observation, and the other is it's interesting because in this presentation of the problem and objective tree, it is very clear, and this I think is very, very interesting. It's very clear that we have different lines of action: inclusion in the labor market, optimization of the training offer, social inclusion, enhanced possibilities of training aimed at integration. So these different lines of action are very well defined, and this can help us to identify different, let's call them strategies, we can call them strategies that lead to the central problem. This is important because our project might choose to include all the strategies, or it might choose to include just some of them. And in this case, it is important to identify all the possible strategies and then state which are the strategies that the project will implement in order to give, again, the idea of how, and Diego?
I think this example is very good to understand that we need to make a brainstorming of the situation, because the social reality is very complex. But when we decide to work in a project, for example, the inclusion in the labor market is a good project because it's very concrete and it helps to arrive to the big project. This is the socioeconomical integration of refugees. So I think in my thinking, this is a good example why we are using this methodology to reduce and to work in a project, in very concrete project.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you very much, Diego, for this observation. It's exactly the idea of a project is to kind of break down a complex problem and tackle a part of it, but without forgetting that there are other elements out of our project that have to be tackled as well. But of course, we can concentrate on one. But it's important to identify them and communicate them, because maybe who is going to fund our project is also going to support another project that tackles a different strategy. So it is important to give a broad picture of where we stand and what we want to do in order to tackle a complex problem. Okay, so thank you very much for this analysis. It's very good, very interesting, and it gave us the opportunity to see different aspects of the analysis. For the other people or groups who have not worked on it, I would ask you to do it maybe for the next time, so as to complete the whole process. In any case, it will be necessary in order to complete the exercise that you should do for the next time, which is this. So as you can see, we jump into the logical framework. We will see the logical framework in detail next time, but as we did for the problem tree and objective tree, the idea is to try to start working on the tool before the session, so that you already have a certain familiarity and knowledge of the difficulties, the problems that may arise in preparing a logical framework. So for next time, using the same project idea of the project of the problem and objective tree, you should fill in the parts in red. So the objective structure, as you see, there is an explanation of what should be written in these different sections. So it is overall objective, purpose, results, and these are directly you can already find them in your objective tree, because they are the objectives that you have identified. In the case of the example that we saw, the objective tree arrives to the purpose. So what will have to be developed is the higher level overall objectives. What is new here is the activities. So the activities will be the tasks that you will need to carry out to get to the results. So for each result that will be described in this section, you will have to describe a few activities in the activity section. I would suggest to keep it simple. This is just an exercise, so maybe consider 2 or 3 activities for each result, or one if one is sufficient, but the idea is just to understand the logic. And the other column that I would ask you to fill in is the assumptions column. So the assumptions, as you can see here in the description, are the factors outside the project management's control that may impact on the linkage between the different levels of the of the logical framework. So in this section, they are the external factors that may impact the linkage between the activities that are identified here and the results. So if I realize the activities, what are the factors outside my control that need to happen so that I can obtain the results? At this level, it is the same thing, but at a higher level. So if I obtain the results of the project, what are the factors outside my control that are necessary to obtain the purpose of the project, the specific objective? And again, once the specific objective is obtained, what are the assumptions necessary to obtain a broader impact contribution to the general overall objective? As you can see, this part of the logical framework does not have assumptions because the logic arrives to the overall objective. So we read the logical framework in let's say, starting from the activities, assumptions at the level of the activities, and then we go to the results, and then we go to we see what the assumptions are at the result levels to arrive to the purpose. So next time we will see all these aspects more in detail, but I think it is interesting to start working on it so that you can have a perception of how it works, and then next time we can see your examples and comment and try to see how to, if they are okay, how they can be eventually improved, and it will be a good start for our discussions. So for today, this would be all. If you have any questions, or else we can consider the session.
I think it's important to make or to revise the exercise 1 in order to do the exercise 2. It's important to have the logic to because this is the idea. The idea is to experiment the methodology and to understand the logic and to understand that this methodology can help us in the writing the next project you will have. Okay, no more questions. Thank you, Nicolo, for this second session, and we will see the next week. I hope you will have time to work to make the exercise, and we will have a new session for discussing and for learning together.
Yes, and just possibly as we start early in the morning, if you could send the exercises maybe by Wednesday morning, so that I have some time to have a look at them.
Okay.
Okay. Bye. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day.
See you next week.
Bye.